Ukrainian forces have expanded their campaign against Russian energy infrastructure, plunging the entire Belgorod Oblast of Russia into a blackout. Just why is Ukraine focusing on damaging Russian infrastructure above almost anything else? And is the U.S. ramping up to give them a big leg up in the fight? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so look, according to Reuters, a missile, which is an important terminology and distinction, has hit a major power plant in Belgorod, forcing a blackout. Right now, this is a breaking story. Reportedly, according to even the governor of the region, he said Ukraine has targeted the region's infrastructure, forcing certain facilities to switch to backup power generators, and it twice struck Belgorod with 6 warheads in total. Now, what's fascinating is that the use of the word missile actually implies that this was not a Ukrainian long-range drone strike, something they've used against Russian oil infrastructure. Instead, this implies that it was actually a medium or long-range missile, possibly a Flamingo, or some reports are saying a HIMARS. And the key here is that this is more evidence of Ukraine adopting a policy to punish the Russian civilian government, but some of their enablers. Again, targeting things like power plants and other civilian infrastructure is sort of giving the Russians a taste of what Russia has done to Kiev. For literally 3 straight years, the Russian government has launched drone strikes against Kiev energy infrastructure, targeting these power plants, but Ukraine has been prohibited up until this point from responding in kind. They've been largely, it's believed, prohibited by the United States and other European allies who've said, listen, if we're going to give you these weapons, you have to use them to strike legitimate military targets. You have to use them to strike military targets, not use them in the same way the Russians are using their drones on you. And really, even the U.S. president has said it's unfair for Ukraine to have to take these sort of strikes and be unable to return them. So after years, it seems like that policy has shifted, and Ukraine is now saying, yes, we're going to go after energy infrastructure. We're going to go after power plants. We're going after oil and gas. And this is all to inflict some level of punishment on an increasingly weary Russian public, and more importantly, a Russian state. Part of it is about humiliating the Russian state, making them look ineffective and impotent, unable to stop even Ukrainian drones. Remember, we're at year 4 of this war. Nearly 1 million Russians have been killed, and the Russian government's official stance is that they were winning early in the war, and they're winning even more now. 4 straight years of winning the war, and so it's pretty embarrassing for Russians to simply say, "Hey, after this long, grueling war, now we're seeing gas shortages, we're seeing blackouts, we're seeing a collapsing economy." The Russian public is probably going to start to say, hey, this was not a war of we're not defending our existence as Russia. We're never under threat from NATO. There was no big NATO invasion force. In fact, other than 50 miles of Kursk Oblast that was briefly held by Ukraine, there's been no threat to the Russian state. And yet we've imposed these massive economic consequences, and really the Russian public has been the ones who faced it, right? Vladimir Putin and the Russian oligarchs are simply not subject to this. But even Russian oligarchs, again, as there's more and more damage to things like oil infrastructure, the Russian oligarchs are increasingly going to be feeling the squeeze themselves. Because, you have the oil infrastructure strikes. You also have, of course, the 1 million Russian casualty number. And that is a problem because that represents 1 million once but no longer able-bodied men that would have been working in places like oligarch-owned nickel mines, oligarch-owned oil and gas, oligarch-owned farm industry, like industrial farming and agriculture. All of these industries are facing massive shortages, labor shortages, as a result of Russian government policy, namely the Ukraine war and the volunteer nature of the soldiers that fight it. So what's fascinating, though, is that the U.S. is doubling down. In fact, the U.S. is reportedly considering, take it with a grain of salt, providing Ukraine long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles. Now, what makes Tomahawk cruise missiles so devastating is that they're very fast. Cruise missiles are much harder to interdict using air defense systems, and they represent a range comparable to those of current Ukrainian drones, but with a massively increased payload. And that would allow, again, and it wouldn't be gifted to Kiev. It would have been purchased by likely EU countries for Kiev. And Ukraine has argued that this would help them seriously weaken Russia's military industry and help bring the war to an end. Simply put, the deputy defense minister of Ukraine said, quote, if the cost of continuing the war for Moscow becomes too high, it will be forced to start peace talks. And Peskov said there was no panacea that can change the situation at the front for the Kiev regime. That's according to Kremlin spokesperson. And that's partially true. There's no super weapon. But Russia is definitely feeling the squeeze, and every new tool to squeeze them harder is going to be make things harder and harder for the Russian economy, and namely the Russian oligarchs, who really who understand that there is no particular special interest in Ukraine, that the Russian economy was actually growing before the war in Ukraine, and that this has become a 4-year-long debacle for Vladimir Putin. And once the punishment really starts to hit these Russian oligarchs and other kind of metropolitan Russians, right? Those Russians who are, like middle and upper class Russians, they have political power, they have influence, they have money, and it is very important for the Putin regime to not necessarily win them over, but to keep them on the sidelines, not politically engaged, not strong in their opinions, and make sure they don't have a popular movement to support. Again, if there was to be some kind of popular anti-Putin movement, that would be really dangerous for the Putin regime. So all of this to say, the fact that the only cope that we're seeing from the Russian state is, well, this won't really do that much, this won't be that big a deal, is actually kind of a clue that it might actually do something and might be that big a deal. Now, bear in mind, again, if it wasn't that big a deal, you wouldn't see, for example, a 12-hour-long bombardment of Kiev with hundreds of drones and 50 missiles that killed 4 and injured 70. That's from Russia hitting Kiev. And so we look at that, and you can be pretty confident that the Russians know what they're doing. They have no interest in stopping. They have played the White House for all they're worth, and now have every plan on continuing their war of aggression in Ukraine and against Europe. Anyway, guys, hit that subscribe. I'm going to keep you posted as we learn more, and become a member at Combat Vet News. Get access to exclusive videos, support the channel, allow me to continue to make these kinds of videos and offer these kinds of takes. And of course, a huge thank you to all of our members. Of course, as I pointed out, because of my stances on some things, you may want to be an anonymous supporter. We can do that, but thanks to AL90, James Porsche, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knudsen, William Alex, Henry Roussier, all of our lieutenant tier members. Could do without you guys. Thanks. Cheers.